In the peaceful farmlands of rural America, 93-year-old Rose Thompson was about to turn a corrupt organization's world upside down when the powerful Whitmore Foundation tried to force her off her century-old family land. They thought they were dealing with just another helpless elderly woman. They couldn't have been more wrong. Her grandson Michael wasn't just any military veteran. He was an elite Navy SEAL commander with 15 years of classified missions. Before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from and if you're enjoying this story. Don't forget to subscribe because I have something really special for you tomorrow. And now, back to the video. Rose Thompson's farmhouse looked exactly as it had for the past 50 years. Its white paint weathered but immaculate. Purple wisteria climbing the wraparound porch just as it had when her grandson Michael was a boy. At 93, Rose still maintained the 10-acre property with the same determination that had seen her through the loss of her husband, the raising of 4 children, and the challenges of holding onto her family's land while neighboring farms were sold off to developers. But something was different today. Michael Thompson noticed it immediately as he turned his truck onto the gravel driveway. After 15 years as a Navy SEAL, his instincts for trouble had become razor-sharp. The curtains in the front window were slightly askew. His grandmother never left them that way, and her beloved cat Perseus wasn't in his usual spot on the porch railing. "Stay alert, boy," he murmured to Rex, his Belgian Malinois service dog. The dog's ears perked forward, sensing his handler's tension. Michael had come home to recover from his last deployment, planning to spend a few quiet months helping his grandmother with the farm. At 38, he'd served in places most Americans couldn't find on a map, completed missions that would never see declassification, but nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him through his grandmother's kitchen window. Rose Thompson sat at her kitchen table, hands folded calmly in her lap, while 2 men in cheap suits stood over her. A third man leaned against her antique hutch, casually displaying a holstered weapon. "Just sign the papers, Mrs. Thompson," one of the suits was saying. "Make this easy on yourself." "Young man," Rose's voice carried clearly through the window, steady as ever. "I've lived through a world war, buried a husband, and raised 4 children on this land. If you think you can intimidate me in my own kitchen, you clearly don't know who you're dealing with." Michael smiled grimly. That was his grandmother, steel wrapped in lace. But he could see what the intruders couldn't. Her left hand tapping quietly on her lap in Morse code, a skill she'd learned as a military wife decades ago. DANGER, LANDGRAB, CAREFUL. The message confirmed what Michael had suspected. Recent natural gas discoveries in the area had sent land prices soaring. Several elderly landowners had reported harassment from aggressive developers trying to force quick sales. "Rex, watch," Michael whispered, setting his dog to guard the back door. Then he moved silently toward the front entrance, years of tactical training taking over. Inside, the confrontation continued. "Mrs. Thompson, Avalon Development has purchased every property surrounding yours. You're the last holdout. The price we're offering is more than fair." "Fair?" Rose snorted. "You're offering half what Jenkins got for his place last month. I may be old, but I'm not senile." The man by the hutch shifted impatiently. "Look, lady, we're trying to be nice about this, but accidents happen to stubborn old people all the time. Stairs get slippery. Rugs trip you up. Fires start in old wiring." Michael had heard enough. His grandmother's hand tapped out one more message. "GOTYOURSIX, she remembered. All those years ago, when he'd first joined the SEALs, he'd taught her that phrase. "Got your 6, I've got your back." Now, as he prepared to deal with the threats in her kitchen, Michael silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought him home today. The 3 men were about to learn a harsh lesson. They hadn't just threatened a helpless old woman, they'd threatened the grandmother of a Navy SEAL, and they were going to regret it. Chapter 2. The stand Michael Thompson didn't survive 15 years of special operations by rushing in blind. As he positioned himself by the front door, His mind catalogued every detail through the window. 3 hostiles, 1 armed, possibly others concealed. His grandmother at the table. Her position suggested they hadn't physically threatened her yet. The kitchen's layout hadn't changed since his childhood. 2 entrances, load-bearing wall between them, clear line of sight to the back door where Rex waited. Rose's fingers kept tapping. Moreoutsid, smart woman. She'd been gathering intelligence while appearing to be just a stubborn old lady. Michael had learned his tactical awareness from more than just the Navy. He could hear their conversation continuing through the slightly open kitchen window. "Mrs. Thompson," the man in the nicer suit was saying, "you should know that Mr. Chen from the bank is very concerned about your mortgage payments." Rose's laugh was sharp. "I paid off this farm in 1985, young man. I haven't had a mortgage in longer than you've been alive." "Records can be complicated," the second suit replied smoothly. "Paperwork gets lost. Banks make mistakes. It would be a shame if foreclosure proceedings started at your age." Michael's jaw tightened. They weren't just thugs. They were running a sophisticated operation. Property records, bank connections, likely corrupt local officials. This wasn't a simple land grab. His military radio earpiece crackled softly. He'd activated it when he first spotted trouble. "Granite Actual, this is Watchdog. Movement in the tree line, you're 3 o'clock. 2 individuals, armed. Good old Jimmy Watchdog Rivera." After serving together in 3 war zones, his former teammate had insisted on accompanying Michael home, setting up a small surveillance operation in the woods across from Rose's farm. "Just in case," he'd said. Now Michael was grateful for his friend's paranoia. "Copy," Michael sub-vocalized. "Hold position. Marking targets Alpha through Echo. I'm engaging the 3 inside." Rose was still playing her part perfectly, arguing about property values and keeping the men focused on her. But Michael caught her slight head tilt. She'd heard something outside too. Probably the backup team moving into position. The armed man by the hutch was getting impatient. "Enough games. Sign the papers or—" The front door opened silently as Michael slipped inside. 15 years of missions had taught him the value of psychological warfare. Let them think they were in control until the last possible moment. "Or what?" he asked pleasantly from the kitchen doorway. The reaction was immediate. The armed man reached for his weapon, but Michael was already moving. Years of close-quarters combat training took over. 2 quick strikes and the gunman was disarmed, his weapon skittering across the floor. The first suit tried to rush Michael, meeting a precise elbow strike that dropped him instantly. The second suit, clearly the leader, was smarter. He stepped behind Rose, trying to use her as leverage. "Back off, or the old lady gets—" He never finished the threat. Rose Thompson might be 93, but she'd raised 4 boys on a farm. The heavy cast-iron skillet she'd kept in her lap swung up with surprising speed, catching her would-be captor square in the face. "Language, young man," she scolded as he crumpled. "And don't ever call me an old lady." Michael secured the 3 men with zip ties while checking in with Jimmy. "Watchdog, status on the outside team?" "They're pulling back, calling someone. Want me to pursue?" "Negative. Hold position. Maintain surveillance. This isn't over." Rose was already making coffee, stepping carefully around the subdued intruders as if they were merely minor inconveniences. "Michael, dear, you should call Sheriff Hayes, though I suppose we'll need to figure out which charges to file first." Michael studied one of the men's phones while they waited for law enforcement. Multiple texts referenced someone called the Commissioner and plans for other properties in the area. This was organized crime, using legitimate business as cover. Exactly the kind of operation he'd seen in failed states and corrupt regions overseas. "Grandmother," he said carefully, "how long has this been going on?" Rose poured coffee into her best china cups, not the everyday ones. "Oh, they've been sniffing around for about 6 months. Started right after they found the natural gas deposits. First it was polite offers, then suggestions, then accidents started happening to people who wouldn't sell." "Accidents?" "The Wilsons' barn burned down. Jeff Murray's cattle got sick. Sarah Chen's brakes failed on her way to church. She sipped her coffee calmly. That's when I started carrying the skillet. Michael couldn't help but smile. His grandmother had always been a force of nature, but he was starting to realize just how much she'd been dealing with alone. The local police? Some are honest, like Hayes. Others, she shrugged. Money talks, especially in small towns during hard times. The leader of the group was regaining consciousness, glaring at them from his zip-tied position on the floor. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he spat. "The commissioner doesn't lose, ever." Rose set down her coffee cup with a decisive click. "Young man, I've spent 93 years building a life on this land. My husband is buried here. My children grew up here. And now you've made the mistake of threatening me in front of my grandson." She turned to Michael with steel in her eyes. "I think it's time we showed these people exactly what the Thompson family is capable of, don't you?" Michael nodded, already formulating plans. He'd fought cartels, terrorists, and warlords. Now he was facing corrupt developers trying to steal his grandmother's land. They were about to learn that some families you don't mess with. "Watchdog," he radioed. "Looks like retirement's postponed. We've got work to do." In the distance, police sirens wailed. But Michael knew this was just the beginning. The commissioner, whoever he was, had made a critical error in targeting Rose Thompson's farm. He'd assumed she was just another vulnerable, elderly victim. Instead, he'd started a war with a Navy SEAL and his 93-year-old grandmother, and neither of them had ever learned how to back down from a fight. Chapter 3. Gathering Storm Sheriff Hayes turned out to be one of the good ones. He arrived with 3 deputies and a grim expression, taking in the zip-tied men on Rose's kitchen floor without much surprise. "Miss Rose," he sighed, "I was wondering when they'd get around to you. Though I didn't expect quite this outcome." He nodded to Michael. "Your grandson, I presume." "Just home from deployment," Rose said proudly. "And not a moment too soon, it seems." Michael watched the deputies process the scene while Jimmy maintained surveillance from his hidden position. The 2 armed men outside had disappeared, but Michael knew better than to think this was over. "Sheriff," he said quietly, pulling Hayes aside, "what can you tell me about the commissioner?" Hayes' face tightened. "Not here. Meet me at Jenny's. Diner in an hour. Bring your grandmother. She needs to hear this too." After the police left with their prisoners, Michael did a perimeter check while Rose changed clothes, insisting on wearing her good blue dress for the trip to town. "Appearances matter," she explained. "Let them see I'm not hiding." Jimmy radioed in. "Got eyes on a black SUV doing slow passes. Want me to intercept?" "Negative. Let them watch. They'll report back to whoever's running this operation. Let them know their intimidation team failed." Rose emerged from her bedroom carrying a small leather briefcase. "Your grandfather's records," she explained. "He kept detailed notes about everything that happened in this valley, including some things certain people might prefer stayed buried." The drive to Jenny's diner was tense. Michael spotted 2 more surveillance vehicles, making no effort to hide their presence. Show of force, letting them know they were being watched. The diner was nearly empty when they arrived, except for Hayes at a back booth and Jenny herself, who hugged Rose fiercely. "Thank God you're okay. When I heard about the men at your place, it'll take more than a few thugs to rattle me," Rose assured her. But Michael noticed his grandmother's hands weren't quite steady as she sat down. Hayes waited until Jenny brought coffee before speaking. "The commissioner is Thomas Blackwood, former State Development Commissioner, now supposedly retired. But he's built himself a nice little empire buying up land ahead of natural resource discoveries." "Inside information?" Michael asked. "Among other things. He's got half the county board in his pocket, judges too. Those deposits under your grandmother's land. His company knew about them 6 months before the official surveys." Rose opened her briefcase, pulling out a worn leather journal. "Henry," My husband was county surveyor for 40 years. He documented everything, including some interesting geological formations he found in 1985. Formations that looked remarkably like what they're calling a new discovery now. Michael flipped through the journal, impressed. His grandfather had included maps, coordinates, detailed observations. This proves they had prior knowledge, that the whole development project is based on insider trading. Won't matter, Hayes said grimly. Blackwood's got federal connections. This goes higher than my jurisdiction. Then we go higher too. Michael pulled out his phone, sending a coded text. Within minutes, it buzzed with a response. Called in some favors, he explained. My old team's intel officer is now with the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force. She's very interested in land fraud schemes targeting the elderly. Rose studied the journal thoughtfully. Henry always said information was power. That's why they've been so aggressive about buying up properties quickly. They need to complete their land grab before the real value becomes public knowledge. A commotion outside drew their attention. 3 black SUVs had pulled up, disgorging. Men in expensive suits. Leading them was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed. Blackwood himself, Hayes muttered. He never shows up in person unless he's worried, Michael finished. The commissioner's personal appearance confirmed they'd struck a nerve. Blackwood walked directly to their booth, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. Mrs. Thompson, I understand there was some unpleasantness with our representatives earlier. I came to personally apologize and make you a better offer. Not interested, Rose replied calmly, sipping her coffee. Ma'am, you don't understand. I'm prepared to offer 3 times market value. You could live very comfortably in one of our senior communities. Young man, Rose set down her cup with a sharp click. I may be old, but I'm not a fool. Your market value is based on farmland prices, not natural gas deposits. And I've buried one husband on that land. I plan to join him there eventually, but not because of your threats. Blackwood's smile tightened. Mrs. Thompson, please be reasonable. Progress can't be stopped. That gas will be extracted one way or another. Is that what you told Sarah Chen before her brakes failed? Michael asked quietly. Or the Wilsons before? Their barn burned? I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Thompson. Navy SEAL, recently returned from deployment, and very interested in who's been threatening my grandmother. Something flickered in Blackwood's eyes. Recognition? Fear, before his smooth mask returned. Well, Mrs. Thompson, I can see you need time to consider our offer. We'll be in touch. As he turned to leave, Michael caught his arm. The commissioner's security detail tensed, but Michael's grip was perfectly calibrated, firm enough to make a point, not enough to justify retaliation. One more accident in this valley, Michael said softly. One more threat to any of these families, and what happens next won't involve lawyers or police. Blackwood yanked his arm free. Is that a threat, Mr. Thompson? No, sir. That's a promise. From me and my old team, we've handled bigger threats than you. They watched the SUVs pull away. Hayes shook his head. You just painted a target on your back. Better on mine than hers, Michael replied. But Rose was smiling, a familiar glint in her eye. Henry's journal isn't the only record I kept, she said, patting her briefcase. Let's see how the commissioner handles what I've got in here. Michael's phone buzzed again. Jimmy reporting more vehicles moving into position around the valley. The storm was gathering. But looking at his grandmother's determined face, Michael knew they'd weather it together. The commissioner had just made his second mistake. First, he'd threatened Rose Thompson. Now he'd revealed himself, shown his hand. And Michael hadn't spent 15 years in special operations without learning how to exploit an enemy's mistakes. Chapter 4. Hidden truths back at the farmhouse, Michael transformed the old barn into a tactical operations center. Jimmy had called in 2 more former teammates, Ghost Martinez and Doc Wilson, who arrived under cover of darkness with enough surveillance equipment to monitor half the county. Grandmother, Michael called. watching her approach the barn with a box of old papers. "You sure you want to set up here? We can move you somewhere safer." Rose snorted. "I haven't missed a morning milking in 50 years. I'm not starting now just because some city slicker thinks he can scare me off my land." Inside the barn, she spread decades of documentation across a makeshift table. Henry wasn't just the county surveyor, he was also the record keeper for the Old Farmers Council. Every land deal, every mineral rights transfer, every accident that forced a family to sell, he documented it all. Ghost whistled as he scanned through the files. "Mrs. T, this is better intel than we had on some combat missions. Look at this, property transfers going back 30 years, all leading to shell companies connected to Blackwood." "That's not all," Rose said, pulling out a small leather-bound diary. "Sarah Chen wasn't the first accident. In 1992, my friend Margaret Whitaker refused to sell her farm. A week later, her house caught fire. The investigation blamed faulty wiring, but Henry found accelerant traces. He just could never prove who was responsible. Michael studied the pattern emerging from the old records. Blackwood's been at this for decades, building his empire one forced sale at a time. But why come out in the open now? Why risk exposing himself because of this? Rose unfolded a geological survey map. "The gas deposits don't just run under my farm. They're part of a massive field that spans 3 counties. But the really valuable deposits, the ones that are easily accessible, they all converge right here, under Thompson land." Doc looked up from his laptop, where he was compiling data. "The development plans they filed with the county show they're planning to put the main extraction facility right where we're standing. Which means they don't just want my land," Rose concluded. "They need it. All their other acquisitions, all their infrastructure plans. None of it works without this property as the centerpiece." Michael's radio crackled. One of Ghost's motion sensors had picked up movement at the property line. Through their surveillance cameras, they watched 3 men in dark clothing moving through the woods. "Just testing our defenses," Michael said quietly. "Let them look. But nobody gets close." To the house, Rose touched her grandson's arm. "Michael, there's something else you need to see." She pulled out an old envelope, yellowed with age. "Henry gave this to me before he died. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure it got to the right people." Inside were photographs, old Polaroids showing younger versions of the commissioner and other men Michael recognized from current county positions. They were standing around a table covered in maps and documents, but what caught Michael's attention was the man in uniform among them. "That's General Stanford," he said sharply. "He was in charge of military land acquisitions in this region 20 years ago, before he retired and joined the board of several energy companies." "Look at the date stamp," Rose pointed out. "This was taken 3 weeks before the military suddenly abandoned plans to build a training facility here. Plans that would have prevented any private development of these resources. The implications were clear. Blackwood's corruption went beyond local politics, reaching into federal and military circles. No wonder he operated with such impunity." Jimmy appeared in the barn doorway. "We've got company coming. Multiple vehicles on the main road. Through their monitors, they watched a convoy of black SUVs approach. But instead of stopping at the farm, they split up, taking positions on all the surrounding roads. "They're setting up a perimeter," Ghost observed. "Cutting us off." "No," Michael corrected, studying the pattern. "They're sending a message. Letting us know we're trapped." Rose calmly began gathering her documents. "Well, they clearly don't know much about farm life. There's not a property in this valley that doesn't connect to the others through old logging roads and creek beds. Henry mapped them all." She pulled out another set of maps, these showing a web of hidden trails through the surrounding wilderness. "The old family's always kept escape routes open. Never knew when you'd need to move livestock in a hurry, or help a neighbor in trouble." Michael's team studied the routes with professional interest. These old paths could give them a serious tactical advantage if things turned ugly. "Besides," Rose added with a glint in her eye, "they're not the only ones who can send messages." She nodded toward the farmhouse. where she deliberately left every light burning. Let them watch. Let them wonder what we're planning. As if, in response, one of the SUVs flashed its high beams, once, twice, 3 times. A warning or a signal to other teams? They'll make a move soon, Michael said. All this surveillance, all this pressure, they're building up to something. Good, Rose replied firmly. Let them come. Between your training and Henry's records, we've got everything we need to take them down. They think they're dealing with a helpless old woman and some rural farmers. Time they learned what happens when you threaten the wrong family. Michael caught Ghost hiding a smile. They'd all heard stories about Michael's fierce grandmother, but seeing her in action was something else. She had the same steel they'd seen in village elders who refused to bow to warlords, the same quiet strength that had sustained resistance movements through impossible odds. The night deepened around the farm as the team continued preparing their defenses. In the distance, the SUVs maintained their vigilance, their occupants unaware that every move they made was being recorded, analyzed, and added to decades of evidence that would eventually destroy their organization. Rose Thompson's farmhouse stood peaceful in the darkness, lights blazing in defiance. Inside the barn, 4 highly trained warriors and 1 indomitable grandmother planned their next moves in a battle that had been brewing for generations. The commissioner thought he was laying siege to a simple farm. Instead, he'd surrounded a fortress, occupied by people who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this fight. The attack came at 2:17 a.m. Michael was monitoring the surveillance feeds when the power to the farm suddenly cut out. Seconds later, all cell service went dead. A mobile jammer, military grade. Right on schedule, he murmured. They'd been expecting this, had prepared accordingly. The barn's equipment ran on independent power, and their communications used encrypted tactical radios that were immune to civilian jamming technology. 3 teams approaching, Ghost reported from his position in the water tower. Professional. Formation, night vision gear. These aren't local muscle. They're private military contractors. Michael smiled grimly. The commissioner had upgraded his forces, bringing in serious operators. But that just meant they'd underestimate what they were facing even more. Doc, status on grandmother? Secure in the panic room with the documents. She's patched into our comms and watching everything through the security feeds. Woman's running tactical, like she's done this before. Indeed. Rose's voice crackled through their earpieces. Michael, dear, they're using the same approach pattern the Jenkins boy tried when he was stealing apples back in '85. The North Fields irrigation system is still active. Michael almost felt sorry for the approaching teams. Almost. Execute pattern Delta, he ordered. The Northfield sprinklers suddenly burst to life, spraying not water, but a mixture that played havoc with night vision equipment. Simultaneously, Ghost triggered a series of flashbangs designed to disorient, without causing permanent damage. The professional discipline of the attacking force immediately became evident. Instead of breaking formation, they quickly adapted, switching to thermal imaging and maintaining their advance. 8 targets, West Team, Jimmy reported. They're carrying breaching equipment, going for the barn. Let them come, Michael replied. Grandmother, you recording all this? Every second, Rose confirmed. Just like Henry taught me. Document everything. The first team reached the barn's outer perimeter. Their technique was excellent, covering angles, maintaining spacing. Everything by the book, which was exactly their mistake. They're expecting a defensive position, Michael explained over the comms. They're not prepared for an offensive response from superior forces. Right on cue, Doc triggered the barn's outer lights, not the obvious flood lamps they'd disabled, but hidden LEDs that created a disorienting strobe effect. Simultaneously, Rex and 2 other military dogs that Ghost had brought launched into action, their barking and aggressive moves forcing the attackers to divide their attention. West Team breaking formation, Ghost reported with professional satisfaction. East Team moving to compensate, they're bunching up. Michael keyed his radio. Special Agent Carson, are you getting all this? Clear as day, came the response from the FBI surveillance van hidden 2 miles away. 12 confirmed PMCs conducting an armed assault. Keep them busy for 3 more minutes. The attackers had regrouped, taking cover behind farm equipment. Their leader's voice carried clearly through the night. "Thompson, we just want the documents. Turn them over and everyone walks away." "Interesting proposal," Michael called back. "Here's my counteroffer." On his signal, Jimmy and Doc moved into flanking positions. The attacking force suddenly found themselves caught in multiple fields of fire. Their supposedly superior position turned into a kill box. "You boys picked the wrong farm," Rose's voice rang out over the external speakers they'd mounted that afternoon. "And the wrong family to threaten." Confusion rippled through the attackers as they recognized the voice of the elderly woman they'd been sent to intimidate. Their hesitation was all the opening Michael's team needed. Moving with the synchronized precision that had made them legendary in special operations, they executed a perfect capture operation. Within minutes, 8 of the attackers were zip-tied and disarmed. The remaining 4 attempted to retreat, only to find their escape route blocked by arriving FBI tactical teams. "Clear," Ghost announced. "All tangos secured." Michael watched. A Special Agent Carson led the arrest teams. They'd been building this case for months, tracking Blackwood's organization across multiple states. Rose's evidence and this failed assault would give them everything they needed for federal charges. "Michael!" Jimmy's urgent voice cut through the aftermath. "We've got incoming. Multiple vehicles, heavy engines, not FBI." Through the tactical feeds, they watched 3 unmarked vans racing toward the farm. The commissioner's backup plan, probably, triggered when his first team missed their check-in. "Carson, we've got another wave incoming," Michael reported. "These aren't contractors. Engine sounds match combat vehicles." "Wet work team," Ghost confirmed grimly. "They're not here to intimidate or steal documents. They're here to clean up loose ends." Rose's voice remained steady over the comms. "Michael, remember what your grandfather used to say about the back 40? A slow smile spread across Michael's face. "Yes, ma'am. I remember exactly what he said about that land." He turned to his team. "Fall back to secondary positions. Let them think we're retreating." "But we're not?" Doc asked, already moving. "No," Michael replied, thinking of his grandfather's careful preparations, his grandmother's decades of planning. "We're leading them exactly where we want them." The vans were getting closer, their occupants unaware they were heading into a trap that had been 50 years in the making. Sometimes, Michael reflected, the best tactical advantages came not from modern technology or special training, but from decades of quiet preparation by people who understood the true value of their land. And the Thompson family had been preparing for this fight for generations. "The back 40 isn't just land," Rose's voice crackled over the tactical radio as the 3 unmarked vans raced toward their position. "Henry spent 30 years preparing it, called it his insurance policy." Michael and his team had fallen back to their secondary positions, making their retreat obvious enough to lure the incoming threat exactly where they wanted them. Through their night vision equipment, they could see the wet work team's vehicles following the most direct route to the farm, the old logging road that cut through the back 40 acres. "Grandmother," Michael asked, "what exactly did grandfather do to this land?" "During the Cold War, Henry was part of a civil defense program," Rose explained. "They were worried about Soviet saboteurs targeting rural infrastructure. The government paid farmers to build certain preparations into their land. Most folks took the money and did the minimum. Your grandfather saw it differently." The vans were halfway down the logging road now, their drivers focused on speed rather than security. They thought they were chasing retreating targets. Instead, they were following a path designed specifically for moments like this. "Now," Rose commanded with steel in her voice. Michael triggered the first sequence. What looked like ordinary fence. Posts along the logging road suddenly sparked to life, creating an electromagnetic pulse that killed the van's engines and electronics. The vehicles rolled to a stop, caught in the kill zone Henry Thompson had designed decades ago. "What the hell?" Ghost breathed, watching through his scope. "Those are military-grade EMP emitters disguised as regular farm equipment." Henry never trusted the government to protect us, Rose said proudly. Said if the Soviets ever came, they'd have to get through the Thompson family first. Spent years building backup systems, escape routes, and defensive positions into every acre of this farm. The wet work team was deploying from their disabled vehicles, moving with the practiced precision of experienced killers. But they were operating blind now. Their night vision equipment and communications had been fried by the EMP. They're still coming, Jimmy reported. 20 plus, heavily armed. These aren't contractors. Their movement patterns suggest former special forces. Good, Michael replied. That means they'll think like soldiers, and soldiers follow predictable tactical responses. Right on cue, the attacking force split into 3 teams, taking what they thought were optimal assault positions. Instead, they were walking right into prepared firing lanes that Henry Thompson had mapped out 30 years ago. Fun fact about the back 40, Rose continued, clearly enjoying herself. All that civil defense money meant we could dig pretty much anywhere without questions. Henry used it to create an underground irrigation system. Would you like to show our visitors how it works, dear? Michael grinned. Ghost Doc, time to water the lawn. The hidden irrigation systems burst to life, but instead of water, they sprayed a mixture of farm chemicals that turned the ground into a slick, disorienting mess. The professional killers suddenly found themselves struggling to maintain their footing, their careful tactical formation disrupted. They're bunching up, Jimmy observed, moving toward the only solid ground they can see. Just like Henry planned, Rose said with satisfaction. That's the only path that looks stable. It leads right to... She didn't need to finish. The solid ground was actually a carefully camouflaged series of containment pits, another civil defense installation that Henry Thompson had modified for his own purposes. As the wet work team moved forward, the ground suddenly gave way beneath them. Not too deep, Rose assured them. Henry wasn't trying to hurt anyone, just wanted to give us time if we ever needed it. The FBI tactical teams had arrived at the outer perimeter now, moving in to secure the trapped attackers. None of the professional killers resisted. They knew they'd been completely outmaneuvered. Check their identification, Michael instructed. The FBI teams. I guarantee none of it will be real, but the weapons will all be military grade. The commissioner sent his cleanup crew, which means we can prove attempted murder, Special Agent Carson finished, joining them, along with use of military equipment, conspiracy, and about 30 other federal charges. The commissioner's not walking away from this one. As the FBI processed the scene, Michael made his way back to the farmhouse where Rose was emerging from the panic room, looking supremely satisfied. Henry always said the best weapon is the one your enemy doesn't know about, she remarked, watching the FBI lead away the would-be killers. All these years, people thought we were just simple farmers. Never occurred to them that we might be something more. Michael hugged his grandmother, marveling at the layers of preparation that had gone into this night. His grandfather's foresight, his grandmother's patience, generations of Thompsons quietly preparing to defend their land. It was a level of planning that would have impressed his SEAL instructors. Still more to come, Ghost warned, monitoring their surveillance feeds. The commissioner won't take this defeat easily. Good, Rose said firmly. Because I've got 50 years of evidence about his organization, and now we've got proof they tried to kill us to get it. Time to take the fight. To them. Michael looked at his grandmother with new appreciation. He'd spent 15 years in special operations, but he was starting to realize that true tactical genius sometimes came wrapped in an apron and baked excellent cookies. What other surprises did grandfather build into this farm? He asked. Rose's eyes twinkled. Oh, honey, we're just getting started. Wait until you see what he did with the old silo. The night was far from over, but Michael knew they'd gained a crucial advantage. The commissioner had sent his best forces, tried to overwhelm them with superior numbers and professional killers. Instead, he'd run straight into 50 years of Thompson family preparation. Sometimes, Michael reflected, the best tactical advantage wasn't modern technology or special training. Sometimes it was an old farmer with a long memory and a patient wife who kept his secrets for decades, waiting for the moment they'd be needed. The war for Thompson Farm was far from over, but after tonight, the enemy would never again underestimate the power of a family protecting its own. Commissioner Blackwood's office occupied the entire top floor of the most expensive building in the state capitol. At 4 a.m., he stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights while his secure phone brought him increasingly disturbing reports. "How many captured?" he demanded. 28 total, sir. Both teams completely compromised. The FBI has them in custody. And the evidence? Still in Thompson's possession. Sir, there's something else. The old woman, she's been documenting everything for decades. And her grandson's team, what about them? They're not just military. We ran deeper checks. These are top-tier operators, the kind that don't officially exist. Blackwood's grip tightened on his phone. 50 years of careful empire building, threatened by one stubborn old woman and her commando grandson. He reached for his private line, the one that connected him directly to the state's power brokers. But at that moment, every light in his office went dark. "Good morning, Commissioner." The voice came from his supposedly secure intercom system. He recognized it, the old woman, Rose Thompson. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance," she continued pleasantly, "but I thought it was time we had a proper chat. How did you get into your systems?" "Oh, that was easy. You see, Henry didn't just prepare our farm, he kept records of everyone who took that civil defense money back in the 60s, including the original plans for this building. Did you know it was designed with a complete backup communication system? Cold War paranoia at its finest." Blackwood lunged for his desk phone. Dead. "I wouldn't bother with your cell either," Rose continued. "My grandson's friend is quite good with electronic warfare. Right now you're completely isolated, just like you tried to make us." Through his windows, Blackwood saw lights flickering in other buildings. Not random outages, a pattern, a message. "What do you want?" "Want? I want you to look out your window, Commissioner. See all those buildings? The ones where you've hidden pieces of your organization? The property records? The shell companies? The bribes?" One by one, lights began coming on in specific offices across the city. "My teammates are paying them visits," a new voice. "The grandson, Michael. Amazing what you can do with old civil defense blueprints and modern tactical training." "You can't prove anything," Blackwood snarled. "Actually," Rose replied, "we already have. Henry didn't just document your land grabs, he documented your early days, back when you were just a hungry young assessor learning to manipulate property records. Remember Margaret Whitaker's farm? The fire that looked like an accident?" Blackwood felt his blood run cold. That was 40 years ago. And Henry was there, testing soil samples, finding accelerant traces. He knew someday someone would need that evidence. Just like he knew your organization would eventually threaten his family. Through the windows, Blackwood could see teams of federal agents entering buildings across the city. All the secret offices, all the hidden records he'd thought were secure. They were all being breached simultaneously. 40 years of evidence. Michael's voice was cold. Decades of families driven off their land, and now attempted murder of a federal witness. The FBI is very interested in how deep this conspiracy goes. "My connections are already under arrest," Rose interrupted. "Did you think Henry only documented your activities? He tracked everyone who helped you. Every bribe, every threatened official, every accident that helped build your empire." Blackwood heard helicopters approaching, not news choppers, law enforcement. "I'll make a deal," he tried. "Name your price." Rose's laugh was sharp and clear through the intercom. "You still don't understand. This was never about money. This was about justice, for every family you hurt, every life you destroyed." "Your time's up, Commissioner," Michael added. "The Thompsonville farm sends its regards." The office doors burst open as FBI tactical teams flooded in. Leading them was Special Agent Carson, holding a very thick warrant. "Thomas Blackwood, announced formally, "You're under arrest for conspiracy, racketeering, and multiple counts of murder." As they led him out, Blackwood caught a glimpse of his empire crumbling on the security monitors. Simultaneous raids across the city, his entire organization being dismantled in a single night. In his earpiece, Rose Thompson had one final message. "Next time you think about threatening an old woman on her farm, remember this night. Remember that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who spend decades preparing for you." The sun was rising over the city as the FBI convoy transported Blackwood downtown. In synchronized raids across 3 states, his carefully built criminal empire was being exposed and dismantled, all because he'd threatened the wrong family. A family that had spent 50 years preparing for exactly this fight. On Thompson Farm, Rose sat in her kitchen, calmly pouring coffee for her grandson's team while they monitored the operation's final phases. Decades of patience, of quiet preparation, had finally paid off. "Your grandfather would be proud," Michael told her, watching the raids unfold on their tactical displays. Rose smiled, serving fresh cookies to the operators who had helped deliver justice. "Henry always said the best victories are the ones your enemy never sees coming. Now who wants milk with their cookies?" The morning after Blackwood's arrest brought a stream of vehicles to Thompson Farm. Not black SUVs this time, but pickup trucks and family cars. Word had spread quickly through the rural community. Families who had lost land to the commissioners. Schemes over the years came seeking hope, carrying their own records and stories. "The Chen family's property seizure was in '98, Rose explained to Special Agent Carson, sorting through decades of Henry's meticulous records on her kitchen table. Cross-reference that with the soil samples Henry took after their accident. Michael watched from the porch as more cars pulled up. His team maintained security, but these weren't threats. These were victims, finally seeing a chance for justice. "Sir?" An elderly man approached, leaning on a cane. "Name's Bill Whitaker. Margaret was my mother." Michael straightened. The first victim they'd discussed. The fire that had started Blackwood's pattern of intimidation. "Your mother was brave," he said quietly. "She inspired my grandfather to start documenting everything." Bill's eyes welled up. "All these years everyone said we were crazy, that there was no proof the fire was intentional. But your grandfather, he kept looking?" "He did more than look," Rose called from the doorway. "Come inside, Bill. I've got something you need to see." Inside the farmhouse, now converted into an impromptu evidence processing center, FBI analysts worked alongside Michael's team, piecing together 50 years of corruption. Ghost had set up a secure communications hub, coordinating with law enforcement across 3 states as more of Blackwood's network unraveled. "Another raid in progress," he reported. "State police found a cache of documents in a judge's summer house. Goes back 30 years. The commissioner's whole operation depended on burying evidence," Doc observed, helping sort through files. He never expected someone would spend decades digging it all up. Sarah Chen arrived with her family, walking with crutches from her accident a few months ago. Her face lit up when she saw the FBI's evidence boards. "You kept our stories," she said softly, looking at Rose. "All of us. Every family he hurt." "Henry believed that truth needs witnesses," Rose replied. "That justice sometimes takes patience." Michael's radio crackled. Jimmy on perimeter watch. "Heads up, got multiple vehicles approaching. Different direction than the locals." Through their surveillance feed, they watched a convoy of expensive cars approaching. Not law enforcement, not more victims. These were power brokers, the kind of people who usually stayed in the shadows. State legislators, Carson identified them. And 2 federal judges. Looks like some folks want to get ahead of this investigation. "Good," Rose said firmly. "Let them come." Henry kept records on them too. The politicians arrived trying to project confidence, but their faces fell as they entered the farmhouse and saw the evidence displays. 50 years of backroom deals, corrupt rulings, and suspicious property transfers, all meticulously documented. Mrs. Thompson, the senior legislator began smoothly. "We're here to discuss a resolution that could benefit everyone." "You mean a cover-up?" Rose interrupted. "Like you tried in '87 with the Miller Farm seizure. Henry documented that too." The man paled. Another official tried. "The state could offer compensation." "To who?" Michael stepped forward. "The families who lost, loved ones in accidents, the people driven off land their grandparents homesteaded. This isn't about money anymore." Rose nodded to Carson, who started distributing federal subpoenas. "This is about justice. For every family that lost their land, every person who was intimidated or hurt, every official who looked the other way." "You don't understand what you're doing," one judge protested. "The economic impact." "Oh, we understand perfectly," Rose replied. "Henry and I spent 50 years understanding it, building evidence, waiting for the right moment. Now it's your turn to understand something." She stood, this 93-year-old woman facing down some of the most powerful people in the state. "You thought you were untouchable, that no one would dare challenge you. But you forgot something important. Rural folks have long memories and longer patience. Through the windows, they could see more cars arriving, more families with stories, more evidence of decades of corruption. Your choice is simple, Carson told the officials. Cooperate with our investigation now, or face charges as co-conspirators. Mrs. Thompson's evidence doesn't just suggest corruption, it proves it. And if you're thinking about applying pressure, Michael added quietly, remember what happened to the commissioner's strike teams last night. The politicians looked around the room, at the evidence boards, the determined faces of the families, the professional operators keeping watch. Decades of power and influence were crumbling in a farmhouse kitchen, brought down by an old woman's patience and her husband's meticulous records. One more thing, Rose called as they turned to leave. Tell your friends, the ones who haven't, come forward yet. Every day they wait to cooperate, we release more evidence. Henry believed in justice, but he also believed in consequences. As the officials rushed back to their cars, Sarah Chen approached Rose. All these years you were building a case. While we thought we were alone, you were gathering proof. Henry used to say that evil depends on good people feeling helpless, Rose replied. So we decided not to feel helpless. We decided to get ready. Michael watched the politicians' convoy speed away, already on their phones. By nightfall, more officials would be scrambling to cooperate. More evidence would surface. More families would find justice. His grandmother had taught him something even special operations training hadn't, that sometimes the greatest weapon isn't force or speed, but patience. The willingness to spend decades preparing, documenting, waiting for the right moment to strike. And now that moment had come, starting an avalanche of justice that would reshape the entire state. 1 week after Blackwood's arrest, Thompson Farm had transformed into something between a command center and a community gathering place. The FBI had set up official operations in the barn, while Rose's kitchen became the heart of a different kind of healing. The Wilson property was taken in '95, Rose explained to a young agent, pouring coffee while consulting Henry's records. Cross-reference that with the county supervisor's vacation home purchase 3 months later. Michael watched his grandmother work, marveling at how she balanced running an evidence processing center with making sure everyone stayed well-fed and comfortable. Currently, she was serving homemade pie to the Chen family while helping them reconstruct the paper trail of their stolen property. Your grandmother is something else, Ghost commented, monitoring their security feeds. They'd maintained protective operations, knowing some of Blackwood's associates were still at large. She's got the organizational skills of a tactical commander. And better cookies, Doc added, accepting a fresh batch from Rose. The investigation had expanded beyond anyone's expectations. Henry's records had exposed corruption across 3 states, leading to over 200 arrests and counting. But more importantly, families were finally getting answers. Mrs. Thompson? Bill Whitaker approached, holding a folder. We found Mom's original deed. The one they claimed was lost in the fire. Rose smiled warmly. Henry kept a certified copy. He knew someday you'd need it. Across the farm, federal agents worked alongside local families, piecing together decades of stolen lives. Each document, each photograph, each careful note Henry had made helped restore another piece of justice. Incoming, Jimmy reported from his observation post. Multiple vehicles, official plates. They watched through surveillance as a convoy approached, state police, federal marshals, and several serious-looking government SUVs. That'll be the Attorney General, Special Agent Carson said. This case just became a national priority. The Attorney General turned out to be a no-nonsense woman who'd grown up on a farm herself. She took one look at Rose's evidence wall and immediately understood. "Mrs. Thompson," she said, studying the decades of documentation, "you've uncovered what might be the largest rural land fraud scheme in American history." "My husband uncovered it," Rose corrected gently. "I just kept it safe until the right time. And that time is now," the AG confirmed. "We're establishing a special task force. The pattern you've exposed, using accidents and intimidation to force land sales ahead of resource discoveries, we're seeing it across multiple states." Michael watched the official briefing from the porch, where he maintained overwatch with his team. More cars were arriving. Families who'd lost land generations ago, each carrying their own pieces of the puzzle. "Your grandfather built more than evidence," Jimmy observed. "He built hope. Gave all these people a chance for justice they never thought they'd see." Inside, Rose was showing the Attorney General something new. A hidden panel in the old root cellar, filled with more records. "Henry knew they might come searching someday," she explained. "So he hid everything in plain sight. Used the same civil defense funding that built the commissioner's secure building to create our own hidden archives." The AG's eyes widened as she saw the scope of evidence. "This goes beyond Blackwood. Some of these names, they're still in positions of power." "Not for long," Rose replied firmly. "Henry believed that evil grows in the dark. Time to let in some light." As if on cue, more vehicles arrived. News vans this time. The story had finally broken nationally. Rose had chosen her moment carefully, waiting until the evidence was too overwhelming to be buried again. Mrs. Thompson, a senior FBI analyst, called urgently. "We found something in the commissioner's private records. A list of other operations, other communities they were targeting." "Send it to the tactical team," Michael instructed. "We'll coordinate with law enforcement, start preventive operations." "Already on it," Ghost confirmed. 3 more communities under threat. "We've got teams moving into position." Rose watched the flurry of activity with satisfaction. "Henry always said justice is like a seed. Plant it deep enough, tend it carefully, and it'll grow stronger than any weed." The sun was setting over Thompson Farm, casting long shadows across land that had seen generations of struggle and perseverance. In the kitchen, families shared stories and hope. In the barn, federal agents built cases that would reshape rural justice. And on the porch, elite operators planned missions to protect other communities from Blackwood's associates. "You know," Michael told his grandmother as they watched another family arrive with their records, "most people would have given up. 50 years is a long time to wait for justice." Rose's eyes twinkled. "Who was waiting? We were getting ready. And now," she gestured at the busy farm, the gathering families, the evidence of corruption finally seeing daylight. "Now we're showing them what happens when you threaten the wrong family." The night deepened around Thompson Farm, but lights blazed from every window. Inside, decades of hidden truth were finally coming to light, and with them, the hope of justice. For generations of rural families who'd thought their stories would never be told. Henry Thompson's patient documentation and Rose's careful preservation had done more than expose one corrupt organization. They'd created a template for fighting back against powerful interests that thought rural communities were easy targets. And in the barn, Michael's team was already planning their next operations. Because somewhere out there, other communities faced similar threats. Other families needed the same kind of protection that the Thompsons had spent 50 years preparing to provide. 1 month after Blackwood's arrest, Thompson Farm hosted a different kind of gathering. Families from across 3 states came not to seek justice, but to celebrate its arrival. The commissioner had pleaded guilty, turning state's evidence against his larger network. Dozens of corrupt officials faced federal charges. But more importantly, stolen lands were being returned to their rightful owners. Rose Thompson sat in her favorite rocking chair on the porch, watching children play in the same fields where armed men had tried to force her off her land just weeks ago. Michael and his team maintained discreet security, but their focus had shifted from protection to prevention. 3 more communities saved this week, Ghost reported, bringing Rose her evening tea. Developers backed off as soon as they realized we were watching. Amazing how sunshine scares away the darkness, Rose replied with satisfaction. Any word from Sarah Chen? Her family's property was officially returned this morning. She's already planning to rebuild the old orchard. The Attorney General's task force had made Thompson Farm its unofficial headquarters, converting the barn into a permanent rural justice center. Henry's methodical documentation had become a template for investigating similar schemes across the country. Your grandfather would be proud, Michael told his grandmother, watching federal agents work alongside local families. His records are helping people he never even met. Oh, he knew, Rose smiled. That's why he was so thorough. Said someday other communities would need a blueprint for fighting back. Bill Whitaker approached the porch, helping his granddaughter carry a large, covered dish. Mrs. Thompson, we brought Margaret's famous apple pie. Found Mom's recipe in the papers you saved. Rose's eyes misted slightly. Henry loved Margaret's pie, said it was worth documenting just like everything else. The farm had become more than just a headquarters for justice. It was a symbol of rural communities standing together. Michael's team had trained local law enforcement in spotting similar schemes. Rose had taught other families the importance of documenting everything. The Thompson family legacy would protect generations to come. Incoming, Jimmy called from his observation post, but his tone was relaxed. Looks like the governor's convoy, the new governor. The old one had resigned in disgrace, had made rural justice a priority. She'd grown up on a farm herself, understood what the land meant to families who'd worked it for generations. Mrs. Thompson, she greeted Rose warmly, I brought you something. It was a formal proclamation, establishing the Henry Thompson Rural Justice Initiative. The program would provide resources and protection for rural communities facing similar threats, ensuring no family would have to spend 50 years gathering evidence alone. It's a good start, Rose acknowledged, studying the document. But remember what Henry always said. Justice needs witnesses, the governor finished. That's why we're funding a network of rural documentation centers, teaching people to protect themselves the way you and Henry did. Michael watched from the porch as more families arrived. Not victims anymore, but survivors, leaders, people who'd learned from the Thompsons that patience and preparation were powerful weapons against corruption. You know, grandmother, he said quietly, when I came home I thought I was here to protect you. Turns out you were teaching me. Rose patted his hand. Family works both ways, dear. Your tactical skills and Henry's records made a perfect combination, just like he planned. As evening fell, the farm glowed with warmth and purpose. In the kitchen, families shared recipes and stories. In the barn, federal agents built cases to protect other communities. And on the porch, a 93-year-old woman and her Navy SEAL grandson watched their legacy unfold. Think they'll ever try something like this again? Michael asked. Rose's eyes twinkled. Let them try, thanks to Henry's records and your team's example. Rural folks everywhere are learning to fight back. Sometimes the best victory isn't beating your enemy. It's teaching others how to stand up for themselves, Michael finished. The night deepened around Thompson Farm, but lights blazed from every window. Inside, Decades of darkness were being transformed into light, showing rural communities everywhere that with patience, preparation, and family standing together, no corrupt power could prevail. And somewhere, Michael knew, his grandfather was smiling. Henry Thompson's patient documentation had done more than expose one corrupt organization. It had created a blueprint for justice that would protect rural communities for generations to come. Rose looked out over her land, peaceful now, but forever changed. "You know what Henry would say about all this?" Michael smiled. "What's that, grandmother?" "Time for pie. Justice works up an appetite." And in the warm glow of Thompson Farm, surrounded by family both old and new, they celebrated not just their victory, but the beginning of something larger. Because sometimes the greatest legacy isn't what you achieve alone, but what you teach others to achieve for themselves. The end.